Hello, my dear friends. Tonight we do not begin in a stone city with aqueducts or paved streets. We begin on open land, endless land. Imagine standing on a wide, rolling plain beneath a pale sky that feels larger than anything you have ever seen. There are no tall buildings, no walls, no permanent roads stretching ahead. Only grasslands that move like waves under the wind. And in the distance, small clusters of round felt tents rising gently from the earth. This is the steppe, and it is here that the Mongol Empire began. If you were placed here suddenly without preparation, you would not last a single day. Not because of immediate violence, but because everything about daily survival here demands knowledge you do not yet have. The Mongol world was not built around cities. It was built around movement. The people who created the largest land empire in history did not rely on stone monuments. They relied on horses, memory, endurance, and discipline shaped by climate. The first challenge would be the environment itself. The steppe is not gentle land. Summers can burn under harsh sun. Winters freeze so completely that rivers turn to solid ice, and the wind cuts through clothing like a blade. Temperatures can drop far below what most settled societies ever experienced. To live here, people needed clothing made from layered animal skins and thick felt. Wool was pressed tightly into dense fabric that blocked wind. Boots were made from leather strong enough to resist ice. Even sleeping arrangements were designed for survival. The Mongol gur, known elsewhere as a yurt, was not a simple tent. It was an engineered shelter made from a wooden lattice frame covered with layers of felt. The circular shape resisted wind. A central opening allowed smoke to escape from the fire inside, while the thick walls trapped heat. You would step into one of these jurs and immediately notice its organization. Beds were arranged along the sides. Storage chests held tools and food. The central stove burned dried animal dung, which produced steady heat in treeless regions where firewood was scarce. Every object had its place. This was not chaos, it was mobile order. Your next challenge would be food. On the steppe, agriculture was limited. There were no large fields of wheat surrounding these camps. Survival depended on livestock. Horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and camels provided milk, meat, hides, and transport. Mongols drank fermented mare's milk called arag. It was slightly sour, mildly alcoholic, and rich in nutrients. Meat was boiled or dried. Fat was valued highly because it provided energy during long rides and cold nights. If you arrived expecting bread or fresh vegetables daily, your body would struggle quickly. The Mongol diet was designed for mobility and endurance, not comfort. And then there were the horses. If you could not ride, you would be helpless. Mongol children learned to sit on horseback almost as soon as they could walk. They grew up balanced and steady, able to guide a horse with their knees while using both hands for other tasks. A Mongol warrior did not ride one horse into exhaustion. He traveled with several, switching mounts during long journeys so that no animal collapsed from fatigue. Horses provided milk, transport, and military advantage all at once. Without skill in riding and caring for them, you would fall behind almost immediately. Water management was another quiet survival skill. Rivers and streams were known through memory passed across generations. Camps moved according to season, following pasture and fresh water. Staying too long in one place would damage grazing land. The Mongols did not mark territory with permanent fences. They understood the land as a cycle. Movement preserved it. Now imagine the social structure. The Mongol world valued loyalty above nearly everything. Families were organized into clans, and clans formed larger tribal units. Leadership depended on ability and support rather than inherited luxury. At gatherings called Kurultai, leaders were chosen through agreement among powerful nobles. Authority was strong, but it was built on trust in skill and fairness. If you entered this world without understanding these bonds, you would misstep quickly. Loyalty was rewarded generously. Betrayal was punished severely. Military training began early. Boys practiced archery from horseback. They learned to fire arrows accurately while riding at full speed. The Mongol composite bow was small but powerful, made from wood, horn, and sinew, layered carefully together. It could send arrows farther than many larger bows used elsewhere. Warriors carried multiple bows and quivers. They did not fight with heavy armor like European knights. Instead, they relied on speed, coordination, and discipline. If you imagine yourself riding across the steppe for hours under open sky, you begin to understand another challenge: endurance. Mongol armies could travel extraordinary distances in a short time. Riders carried dried meat that could be softened in water while traveling. They drank from leather flasks filled with milk. Rest was brief. Signals passed through flags, horns, and messengers riding at incredible speed. A soldier unable to keep pace would simply fall behind and be left vulnerable. But survival in the Mongol Empire was not only about war. It was about adaptation. When the empire expanded beyond the steppe into China, Central Asia, Persia, and Eastern Europe, Mongol leaders did not destroy every system they encountered. They often preserved local administrators and craftsmen. Skilled engineers, scribes, and merchants were valued. Trade routes across Asia became safer under Mongol protection, allowing goods to move from China to Europe more freely than before. Yet even in these vast cities, the core Mongol leadership maintained their steppe identity. They often preferred living in gurs rather than permanent palaces. Imagine yourself suddenly placed in this environment. You would need to ride skillfully, eat unfamiliar food, endure extreme weather, understand clan loyalty, and adapt to constant movement. You would need to wake before dawn, mount a horse without hesitation, and travel across land without landmarks. There are no street signs, no fixed roads, only horizon. And as night falls across the grasslands, fires glow inside circular tents. Horses rest tethered nearby, and guards watch the dark plain carefully. The wind moves across the steppe without obstruction. The world feels enormous and exposed. Survival here depends not on walls but on awareness, discipline, and community. This is only the beginning. In the next part, we will move deeper into the daily rhythm of Mongol military life, how they organized their armies, communicated across vast distances, and created an empire so wide that it reshaped global trade, all while remaining rooted in the harsh lessons of the steppe. As the cold morning wind moves across the steppe and the camp begins to stir, you would quickly realize that Mongol military life was not a separate profession from daily life. It was daily life. A Mongol man was not first a farmer and then occasionally a soldier. He was a rider, hunter, herdsman, and warrior all at the same time. The skills needed for survival in this landscape naturally became the skills that created the empire. Before sunrise, the camp was already active. Horses had to be checked, fed, and rotated. Saddles were inspected because a damaged strap during travel could mean serious injury far from help. The Mongols used lightweight saddles with high wooden frames that gave riders balance even while standing slightly in the stirrups. This design allowed them to shoot arrows accurately while the horse moved beneath them. To you, riding all day would feel exhausting, but to them, it was ordinary movement, almost like walking. The Mongol army was organized with remarkable precision. Instead of large, confusing groups, they divided forces into clear units based on tens. 10 men formed a small group. 10 of these formed 100. 10 hundreds formed 1,000. 10 thousands formed what we call a tumen, the primary large military formation. Each level had a leader responsible not only for combat, but for discipline, supplies, and communication. This structure made coordination possible across enormous distances. Orders could travel quickly from a commander down through each level without confusion. Communication itself became one of the empire's greatest strengths. Riders carried messages constantly, but even more impressive was the relay system known as the yam. Along major routes, stations were placed a day's ride apart. At each station, fresh horses waited. A messenger arriving exhausted would immediately transfer the message to another rider, or take a new horse and continue. Because of this system, news could travel across thousands of kilometers faster than most settled kingdoms believed possible. A command issued far away might reach an army within days rather than weeks. You would also notice that Mongol warriors carried relatively little equipment compared to heavily armored soldiers elsewhere. They wore layered leather or lamellar armor made from small plates tied together. It was flexible and lighter than heavy metal armor, allowing long rides without exhaustion. Each rider carried several bows, multiple arrows, a curved saber, and rope for many uses, tying animals, securing loads, or even assisting in capturing enemies. Their gear was practical rather than decorative. Every item had a purpose. The most difficult part for you, however, would be the pace. Mongol armies did not move slowly toward a battlefield and wait. They traveled continuously. A warrior might ride for many hours, rest briefly, and ride again. They often approached targets from unexpected directions, crossing mountains or deserts others considered impassable. They carried dried meat that could be softened in water, and sometimes they drew small amounts of blood from a horse's vein and drank it mixed with milk, a method that allowed survival without stopping to hunt. This was not cruelty, but necessity, developed in a land where stopping too long could mean starvation. Training never truly ended. Even during peaceful movement, riders practiced archery. They could fire backward while retreating, a maneuver that confused enemies who believed the Mongols were fleeing. In reality, retreat was often a planned tactic. A unit would appear to withdraw, drawing opponents into pursuit. As the enemy formation stretched and lost order, hidden Mongol units would surround them from multiple directions. Coordination required trust and discipline. Every rider needed to follow signals immediately. Signals themselves were simple but effective. Flags indicated movement. Horns announced attack or regrouping. Smoke or fire signaled across distances. Because everyone understood these signs from childhood, large groups could maneuver almost silently without complex spoken orders. You would struggle to interpret them quickly enough, and hesitation during such moments could be dangerous. The Mongols also valued intelligence gathering. Scouts rode far ahead of the main force, learning terrain, rivers, and settlements. They memorized routes and reported back. Maps were not always drawn on paper, Often they existed in memory, passed orally between riders. Knowledge of land replaced reliance on permanent roads. Camp discipline remained strict. Guards watched at night in rotating shifts. Horses were tethered carefully. Equipment was kept ready for sudden movement. The army could pack and depart quickly, sometimes before sunrise. There was little luxury, but there was reliability. Each person understood his role clearly. You would likely struggle most with the absence of stillness. In many societies, a day ends with rest inside secure walls. Here, even rest carried awareness. The horizon remained open in every direction. The camp's safety depended on watchfulness rather than fortifications. Every member shared responsibility, and yet despite this constant readiness, the Mongol army was not disorderly. It functioned through cooperation and predictable structure. Loyalty to leaders and companions was essential. A soldier depended on his group for survival in harsh land, so discipline was reinforced not only by command but by mutual reliance. As the sun sets again and riders return from scouting, horses breathe softly in the cooling air. The camp quiets, but never fully sleeps. Somewhere beyond the darkness, another messenger rides toward the next relay station, carrying orders across a continent-sized empire. In the next part, we will look beyond the battlefield and into how the Mongols governed conquered territories, managed trade, and connected distant civilizations in ways few empires ever achieved. When people imagine the Mongol Empire, they often picture only fast horses and battles. Yet what truly made the empire endure was not just conquest. It was administration. After armies moved on, the Mongols had to rule lands filled with farmers, merchants, scholars, and craftsmen, who lived very differently from the riders of the steppe. Governing cities required a different skill than surviving open grassland, and here again you would struggle, because the Mongol system combined mobility with strict order. When a city submitted peacefully, it was usually spared destruction and quickly placed under organized control. Instead of replacing every official, Mongol leaders often kept local administrators who already understood taxation and record-keeping. A Chinese clerk continued managing grain storage. A Persian accountant continued tracking revenue. The Mongols did not insist everyone live as nomads. They wanted stability, tribute, and reliable communication. Their rule depended on efficiency more than uniform culture. To oversee these distant territories, the Mongols used trusted governors and inspectors who traveled constantly. They did not remain in a single palace. They moved between regions, checking reports, hearing complaints, and ensuring taxes reached the central authority. This movement reflected their steppe origins. Power did not sit permanently in one building. It traveled with leadership. The empire also introduced official passports called paisa. These were small metal tablets carried by envoys and merchants. When shown at relay stations, the holder received fresh horses, food, and safe passage. For the first time across much of Asia, a traveler could cross enormous distances with relative security. Roads did not need stone paving to function. Safety and communication mattered more. Under Mongol protection, caravans carrying silk, spices, metalwork, and textiles moved steadily along routes later called the Silk Road. Merchants benefited greatly. The Mongols encouraged trade because it brought wealth without farming the harsh steppe themselves. Caravanserais, roadside inns, appeared along trade routes. Here travelers rested, Animals were watered, and goods were protected. Guards often accompanied caravans through dangerous regions. A merchant could travel from China toward the Middle East and expect assistance at stations spaced across the route. Without understanding the customs of negotiation, tribute, and protocol, you would find it difficult to participate safely in such a system. Religious tolerance was another feature unfamiliar to many societies at the time. The Mongols followed their traditional beliefs, but allowed conquered peoples to practice their own religions. Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, Christian priests, and others lived within the empire simultaneously. Leaders believed spiritual diversity did not threaten authority as long as loyalty and taxes were maintained. This policy reduced rebellion and helped stabilize large populations. Taxation was carefully organized. Instead of random collection, censuses recorded households and livestock. Taxes might be paid in goods, grain, cloth, animals, rather than coins, especially in rural regions. Officials kept records so supply lines to the army and capital remained steady. For a nomadic leadership, managing agricultural production required cooperation with local experts. The system depended on clear reporting and harsh penalties for corruption. Postal communication expanded even further than in military use. The relay stations carried government messages, trade information, and sometimes diplomatic envoys from distant kingdoms. Messages moved faster across the Mongol Empire than across many smaller neighboring states. This speed allowed leaders to respond quickly to problems, reinforcing control over vast land. Law also played a major role. The Mongols followed a code often called the Yasa, a collection of rules attributed to Genghis Khan. It emphasized discipline, loyalty, and protection of envoys and merchants. Theft of animals, disobedience in battle, or betrayal of leaders brought severe punishment. But the same laws also protected trade caravans and guaranteed safety for messengers. Order benefited the empire's stability. Even in large cities, Mongol leaders sometimes preferred living in traditional gers set up within palace grounds, rather than occupying permanent rooms. This was not rejection of cities, but preservation of identity. They ruled agricultural and urban populations while personally maintaining nomadic habits. For you, adapting would be difficult because survival required understanding both worlds at once. One day you might ride across grassland, the next negotiate inside a crowded marketplace filled with languages you do not know. You would need to respect customs of many cultures while obeying Mongol authority. Misunderstanding a greeting, a tax demand, or a travel permit could lead to serious trouble. As evening settles over a caravan route, merchants cook meals beside loaded camels while a relay rider arrives carrying news from distant provinces. Somewhere far away, another governor reads that message and prepares a response already beginning its journey back across the empire. Movement never stops. In the next part, we will step inside daily family life, how ordinary Mongol households functioned, how women played powerful roles in managing camps and property, and why social expectations alone would make survival challenging for an outsider. Now we step away from armies and trade routes and enter the heart of Mongol life, the household itself. If you imagine a warrior society controlled only by men on horseback, you would misunderstand the step completely. The Mongol Empire depended just as much on families as on soldiers, and within those families women held responsibilities that visitors from many settled societies would find surprising. Approach a camp slowly and you would first see the arrangement of the gers. They were not scattered randomly. The placement followed order based on kinship and status. Important families occupied central positions while others formed circles around them. The entrances usually faced south, away from the cold northern winds and toward sunlight. Even this simple detail showed careful adaptation to climate. Inside a jir, life followed established patterns. The interior space was divided symbolically. One side stored tools and saddles, another held cooking equipment, and a place of honor faced the door where guests were seated. The central hearth burned continuously because fire meant warmth, food, and survival. Stepping on the threshold or touching certain objects without permission would be seen as disrespectful. An outsider unfamiliar with these customs could offend hosts unintentionally within minutes. Here you would notice something essential. While men often rode with herds or armies, women managed the daily operation of the camp. They assembled and dismantled the jir during migrations, a process requiring strength and coordination. Wooden frames were folded, felt coverings rolled, and everything loaded onto carts drawn by oxen or camels. A well-organized family could take down a home and move across the steppe within hours. Women also controlled food production. They milked animals several times a day, processed milk into butter, cheese, and arag, and stored supplies for travel. They repaired clothing, managed household goods, and oversaw servants or captives. When men left for campaigns, women maintained property and negotiated local matters. In some cases, noble women even administered territories or commanded troops in their husband's absence. Authority inside the family did not disappear simply because men were warriors. Children grew up surrounded by responsibility early. Young boys learned to ride before they could run confidently. Small bows were given for practice. Girls learned to manage animals and prepare food. There was little separation between childhood and adulthood. Every member contributed to survival, and idleness was discouraged because the environment allowed little waste of effort. Hospitality formed another strict rule. Travelers arriving peacefully were offered food and drink. Refusing hospitality or behaving rudely toward a guest could damage reputation. At the same time, guests were expected to behave respectfully. One did not step over cooking utensils, lean against support poles, or sit in the place of honor without invitation. These customs were not minor details. They preserved order and mutual trust in a world without permanent inns or walls for protection. Marriage alliances held political importance as well. Families connected clans through marriage, strengthening loyalty across distances. Gifts of animals and goods accompanied these unions, reinforcing relationships between groups. Understanding these bonds was necessary because loyalty extended beyond the immediate household into wider networks of support. Daily work filled nearly every hour. Herds had to be moved to fresh pasture. Sick animals required care. Saddles and harnesses needed repair. Leather was dried, rope braided, and carts maintained. A sudden storm could threaten animals, forcing families to move quickly to safer ground. You would quickly realize there was no fixed schedule like a city day divided into business hours. Life followed weather and animals rather than clocks. The role of elders was respected deeply. Older family members advised leaders, settled disputes, and preserved memory of routes and seasonal patterns. Without written maps, knowledge passed through stories and instruction. Forgetting a water source or migration path could mean disaster. Listening carefully to elders was therefore a matter of survival, not mere courtesy. For an outsider, adapting would be exhausting. You would need to learn etiquette immediately, assist with work constantly, and endure travel across open land with little privacy. Nights were shared spaces, and silence was rare because animals and wind surrounded the camp. The idea of personal room or fixed home would disappear quickly. Yet within this demanding life there was also security. A person belonged to the group and the group protected its members. Shared labor created strong bonds. The same discipline that guided armies also structured families. As dusk settles over the camp, herds gather nearby and cooking fires glow through the felt walls. Voices carry softly across the grassland while someone watches the horizon. The world remains open and exposed, but within the circle of tents there is order maintained through custom and cooperation. In the next part, we will look at the climate itself, the harsh winters, sudden storms, and environmental challenges that shaped Mongol endurance and explain why surviving even a single season required skills far beyond simple courage. Now we turn to the true ruler of the steppe, not a Khan, not an army, but the climate itself. Everything in Mongol life was shaped by weather. The empire's people did not conquer nature. They learned to live within its rhythms. And this is perhaps the strongest reason you would struggle to last even a single day here, because the land never allowed comfort to become permanent. Winter on the steppe arrived early and without gentle warning. The sky grew pale and the wind strengthened across the open plains where no mountains or forests blocked its path. Temperatures fell so low that breath froze in the air and exposed skin numbed quickly. Snow did not always fall heavily, but the cold hardened the ground into stone. Rivers froze solid enough for riders and herds to cross. The danger was not only freezing air, it was starvation. Grass vanished beneath frost and animals struggled to graze. Families had to anticipate this months in advance. During late summer and autumn, Mongols prepared carefully. They dried meat into hard strips that could last the entire winter. Milk was turned into hard cheese that would not spoil. Animal fat was stored because it provided essential energy. Herds were moved toward sheltered valleys where wind was weaker. If preparation failed, a family could lose its animals, and losing animals meant losing transport, clothing material, and food all at once. Your clothing would become your protection. Mongols layered garments of wool, felt, and fur. Long coats wrapped tightly around the body and belts secured them to keep heat from escaping. Hats covered ears and neck. Boots were thick and high to prevent frostbite. Even then, daily tasks continued outdoors. Animals needed care no matter the temperature. Water had to be broken from ice. Fire fuel, dried dung collected months earlier, had to be carried and stored carefully. Without knowing how to dress and work efficiently in this cold, exhaustion would come quickly. Spring brought relief but also danger. Melting snow turned ground soft and muddy. Rivers swelled suddenly, making crossings risky. Herd animals weakened from winter needed careful attention. Young animals were born, requiring protection from cold nights. Camps moved frequently, searching for fresh pasture while avoiding flooded areas. Travel was slow and demanding. Summer transformed the land again. Grass grew tall, herds fattened, and milk became abundant. Yet heat and insects replaced winter hardship. Riders traveled long distances to graze animals widely, so no pasture was destroyed. Thunderstorms appeared quickly, and lightning on open plains posed real threat. There were no buildings to hide inside. Families learned to watch the sky constantly and adjust their position before storms reached them. Autumn was perhaps the busiest season. Every family worked almost without pause to prepare supplies for the coming winter. Hunting supplemented herds. Equipment was repaired. Saddles and ropes were checked. Children gathered fuel while adults processed food. There was no concept of waiting until a problem appeared. Survival depended on anticipation. Weather also affected travel and war. Mongol armies often moved in winter because frozen rivers allowed faster passage across territories enemies believed impassable. Snow could conceal approach, and cold slowed opponents unfamiliar with such conditions. But Mongol riders understood their horses' endurance and knew where to find shelter along routes remembered through generations. Even simple daily actions depended on environment. Water sources shifted with seasons. Grasslands recovered slowly if overused, so camps rotated locations yearly. Families did not own land in the fixed sense. They used land responsibly to ensure future survival. This relationship between people and environment was learned through experience, not written instruction. You would likely struggle most with the constant alertness required. In cities, weather changes affect comfort. On the steppe, they determine survival. A delayed migration, a misjudged storm, or poor preparation could endanger an entire household. The Mongols developed resilience because their world demanded it every day. As night falls in winter, the wind moves across frozen ground and presses against the felt walls of the gyre. Inside, the fire glows, and people sit close together, conserving warmth. Outside, horses stand with heads lowered against the cold. There are no distant streetlights, no stone shelters, only darkness and open sky. Yet within this harsh environment, the Mongols found stability by understanding nature rather than resisting it. In the next part, we will look at communication and intelligence, how the Mongols gathered information, coordinated across continents, and used knowledge itself as a powerful tool of survival and expansion. After understanding the land and the family, we now come to something less visible but just as powerful: information. The Mongol Empire was not held together only by riders and horses. It was held together by knowledge moving constantly across distance. Messages, reports, warnings, and instructions traveled day and night, and without this flow of information, the empire could not have survived its own size. For you, this would be another challenge, because life in the Mongol world depended on awareness at all times. Across the empire stretched a communication network far more organized than many settled kingdoms possessed. Relay stations were placed along major routes, often a day's ride apart. Each station kept fresh horses ready and supplies prepared. A messenger arriving dusty and exhausted did not rest long. He showed his authority tablet, received a new mount, and continued almost immediately. Because of this system, orders from the Khan could cross enormous distances with surprising speed. The riders themselves were trained for endurance. They carried light equipment and knew the terrain. They memorized routes rather than relying on written maps. Rivers, hills, and distant mountains served as markers. At night, they navigated by stars. During storms, they sheltered briefly and moved again. A single message might pass through many hands, but each rider knew his portion of the journey precisely. You would notice that these messages were not only military commands. Reports about harvests, trade goods, and local disputes also traveled along the same network. Governors informed leaders about taxes collected and problems arising in cities. Merchants carried news of markets and shortages. Even foreign envoys relied on this system to reach the court safely. The empire functioned because information reached decision-makers quickly enough for action. Spies and scouts formed another layer of knowledge. Before armies approached new territory, riders gathered details quietly. They observed roads, rivers, defenses, and supplies. They learned languages and customs to blend into local populations. Sometimes merchants traveling ahead of armies also collected information without drawing suspicion. The goal was preparation. Battles were often decided before they began because Mongol leaders already understood the terrain and the enemy's habits. Signals in the field were equally important. During movement, units communicated through flags raised at specific angles. At night, torches or fires carried instructions across hills. Horn calls indicated retreat, advance, or regrouping. Because every soldier learned these signals early in life, large forces could maneuver smoothly without shouting commands across distances. Punishment for interfering with communication was severe. Messengers and envoys were protected under strict law. Harming them was treated as a grave offense because it threatened the entire structure of authority. Protecting communication routes meant protecting stability. Even ordinary people relied on this network. Traders planned journeys according to reports from relay stations. Travelers asked riders for news of safe routes or dangers ahead. Weather conditions, river levels, and grazing conditions could be shared quickly. Knowledge reduced risk in a land where mistakes carried heavy consequences. You would find the constant movement of news unusual. In many places, information traveled slowly through rumor. Here it moved intentionally and regularly. Decisions were expected to follow quickly. Delays were seen as weakness because the environment and politics changed rapidly across such a large empire. At night, when most camps slept, some riders were still on the move. Hoofbeats crossed dark plains as messages continued toward distant provinces. Somewhere another station keeper waited with a fresh horse already saddled, listening for arrival. The empire never truly rested because information never stopped. In the next part, we will step into trade and travel. How merchants, craftsmen, and foreign visitors moved across Mongol lands and why, despite its harsh reputation, this empire became one of the safest long-distance travel zones of its time. Now we leave the military riders and look at the travelers who were not soldiers at all. Merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and messengers from distant lands. One of the most surprising realities of the Mongol Empire is that, once conquest ended and control was established, the vast territory became one of the safest long-distance travel regions of its time. This peace, sometimes called the Pax Mongolica, did not come from gentle conditions. It came from strict order, constant patrols, and the certainty that law would be enforced. Imagine beginning a journey across Asia. In many earlier periods, a merchant feared bandits, hostile borders, and unpredictable rulers. But under Mongol authority, the same merchant could cross thousands of kilometers through different climates and languages while carrying valuable goods. He carried an official tablet or permit, showing that he traveled with protection. At relay stations, he received food, fresh animals, and directions. Guards watched main routes carefully because trade was valuable to the empire's wealth. Caravans moved slowly but steadily. Camels carried silk from China, spices from India, glassware from the Middle East, and metals from distant mines. The caravan leaders knew the distance between water sources and the safest places to rest at night. Camps were arranged in circles with animals inside and guards at the edges. Fires burned low to conserve fuel. At dawn, loads were secured, and the line moved again across plains and deserts. You would struggle here because travel required endurance and patience. Journeys lasted months, sometimes longer than a year. There were no comfortable inns every evening. Caravanserais appeared along important routes, but between them stretched long distances. Dust storms could appear suddenly. Water had to be rationed. Food was simple and repetitive. Every traveler needed to contribute to work, feeding animals, loading goods, and keeping watch. The Mongols encouraged this movement because trade connected distant economies. Paper, gunpowder, printing knowledge, and artistic styles traveled along with silk and spices. Craftsmen relocated from one region to another to serve rulers. Engineers moved to repair cities. Diplomats carried letters between courts. The empire functioned not only as a territory but as a bridge between civilizations. Foreign visitors wrote about their surprise at how organized the system was. They described stations stocked with supplies and officials ready to help authorized travelers. Even unfamiliar languages became less of a barrier because interpreters often worked along major routes. Communication mattered to the Mongols. Commerce strengthened their control. Markets inside cities reflected this mixing of cultures. A traveler might hear several languages in a single marketplace. Clothing styles blended. Food varied widely. Rice in one region, bread in another. Dairy products from the steppe. Spices from southern lands. For the Mongols, these goods were useful, but they still valued the simple diet of their homeland. Even powerful leaders often preferred familiar foods brought by herds rather than urban cuisine. Security remained strict. Theft along major routes was punished severely because it threatened trade and trust. Patrol riders inspected areas regularly. If a caravan disappeared, local officials were expected to investigate quickly. Responsibility extended across regions so that safe travel remained predictable. For someone unfamiliar with such a system, the constant movement, different customs, and long distances would feel overwhelming. You would need to adapt your behavior depending on region while still obeying Mongol authority everywhere. A mistake in greeting, trade agreement, or travel permission could create serious problems. As evening settles across a desert route, camels kneel while loads are removed and travelers gather around small fires. The sky above stretches wide and filled with stars. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another caravan moves toward the same station, guided by memory and routine. Across the empire, thousands of people travel at once, connected by shared protection and order maintained by mounted patrols. In the next part, we will look at law and discipline, how Mongol rules governed behavior across such a vast territory, and why the strictness of those rules alone would make surviving a day as an outsider extremely difficult. After travel and trade, we now arrive at the part of Mongol life that surprised many outsiders the most: their law. The empire was enormous, filled with different languages and customs, yet its leaders understood something simple. Without strict rules, such a vast territory would fall into disorder very quickly. So they enforced a code of conduct that was clear, direct, and taken very seriously. This legal structure, often connected to the traditions established under Genghis Khan, shaped everyday behavior far beyond the battlefield. The first thing you would notice is that discipline was expected from everyone, not only soldiers. Obedience to leadership and loyalty to one's group formed the foundation of society. A person did not act only for himself. His behavior affected his entire family and clan. because survival on the steppe depended on cooperation. Actions that disrupted order were treated as serious matters. The laws emphasized protection of communication and trust. Messengers, envoys, and official travelers were considered essential to stability. Harming them or interfering with their work brought severe punishment. The reason was practical. The empire relied on information moving quickly. If riders feared attack, the entire system would slow and chaos would spread. Therefore, safety for those carrying messages was non-negotiable. Theft was another offense treated with extreme seriousness. Livestock in particular represented wealth, transport, and food. Stealing animals endangered a household's survival, so it was not viewed as a minor crime. The strictness was meant to prevent cycles of revenge between clans. Instead of personal retaliation, authority enforced order so communities could live side by side without constant conflict. Military discipline followed similar principles. During campaigns, soldiers were forbidden to abandon their unit or disobey signals. Retreat without command or breaking formation endangered others. Punishments were harsh, but they created predictability. Each warrior trusted that his companions would act according to known rules. In such an environment, reliability became more valuable than individual heroism. There were also laws designed to maintain fairness in shared resources. Water sources and grazing lands were used carefully. Wasting food or damaging supplies could be punished because resources on the steppe were limited. Even small actions mattered. For example, certain behaviors around fire and cooking areas were regulated to avoid accidents or conflict within the camp. You would find the expectations challenging because they extended into everyday manners. Respect toward elders and leaders was required. Guests were treated with formal courtesy, and guests themselves had to follow proper conduct. Sitting in the wrong place inside a gyre, touching belongings without permission, or ignoring instructions could be taken as disrespect rather than simple mistake. These customs preserved harmony in close living conditions. Another striking feature was religious tolerance combined with political obedience. People could follow their own spiritual practices, but loyalty to Mongol authority remained essential. Leaders believed unity came from shared law rather than shared belief. This allowed diverse populations to coexist under one system while still maintaining order. Punishment, when applied, was intended to discourage repetition rather than create long legal debates. Decisions were often swift. The certainty of consequence mattered more than complexity of procedure. While this could appear severe, it also meant disputes did not linger unresolved for long periods. For an outsider, survival would depend on learning these expectations immediately. You would need to watch carefully, speak respectfully, and avoid actions that might seem harmless in another culture. The Mongol world allowed little room for careless behavior because each person's actions affected the group's stability. As night spreads across the camp, guards take their positions and fires burn steadily inside the tents. The quiet order you see is not accidental. It is maintained by shared rules, understood by everyone present. In the next part, we will look at leadership itself. The khans and commanders, how they earned loyalty and why authority in the Mongol Empire depended not only on power, but on reputation and trust. Now we move toward the center of authority itself, leadership. The Mongol Empire did not function like many settled kingdoms where a ruler stayed behind palace walls and commanded from a distance. A Mongol leader was expected to live much like his people, travel with them, endure the same weather, and prove his ability repeatedly. Authority came not only from birth, but from visible competence, and without earning respect, a leader could not hold loyalty for long. At the top stood the great Khan, chosen during a gathering called a Kurultai. This assembly brought together powerful nobles and clan leaders who discussed and agreed upon leadership. It was not a casual meeting. Travel to the gathering itself could take weeks as riders crossed vast land to attend. Once there, decisions were made carefully because unity mattered more than speed. A ruler who lacked support would struggle to command armies spread across continents. What made Mongol leadership difficult for outsiders to understand was its closeness to daily life. The Khan did not remain hidden in a distant capital. He moved with his court, often living in large jirs instead of permanent palaces. Important officials traveled with him: advisors, guards, scribes, and family members. Wherever the Khan stayed, temporarily, became the center of government. This mobility allowed him to stay connected to different regions rather than tied to one city. Leaders were expected to demonstrate skill. A commander needed to ride well, hunt effectively, and understand the hardships faced by soldiers. Decisions were respected because followers believed their leader knew the realities of the steppe. Commands were obeyed quickly because they were trusted to be practical, not merely ceremonial. Loyalty between leader and follower worked both ways. A Khan rewarded service generously. Warriors who performed well received animals, goods, or authority over captured territory. Sharing success strengthened bonds between ruler and companions. A leader who ignored loyalty risked losing support, and in the steppe, losing support meant losing power. Family also played a role in leadership. Relatives of the ruling line governed different regions, but they were expected to cooperate rather than compete openly. Disagreements still occurred, yet the structure aimed to prevent constant civil war by dividing responsibility clearly. Communication through messengers allowed the Khan to remain informed about distant territories. You would notice that authority relied heavily on reputation. News of victories, fairness, or cruelty traveled quickly across the empire. A respected leader encouraged cities to surrender peacefully because they trusted promises of order. A distrusted one faced resistance. For this reason, Mongol rulers understood the importance of predictable behavior. Consistency created stability across lands filled with diverse populations. Advisors from conquered regions were often welcomed. Scholars, administrators, and translators helped leaders manage unfamiliar cultures. The Mongols valued ability. Someone who could provide useful knowledge might gain influence regardless of origin. This openness strengthened governance while preserving the core traditions of the steppe. Ceremonies still existed, but they were simpler than many royal courts elsewhere. Formal greetings, gifts, and feasts marked important events. Guests presented tribute and received hospitality. Even these gatherings, however, reflected practicality. They reinforced alliances and communication rather than purely display. For you, adapting would require understanding subtle expectations, speaking directly yet respectfully, offering gifts properly, and recognizing rank quickly would matter. A mistake before a leader could be taken as disrespect, especially if repeated. Observing carefully and learning quickly would be necessary to avoid trouble. As evening settles across the moving court, guards stand watch outside the Khan's tent while messengers arrive with reports from distant provinces. Horses graze nearby, ready for travel at dawn. Leadership here does not sleep in permanent comfort. It travels, listens, and decides constantly. In the next part, we will enter the final stretch of our journey and see how daily survival, law, climate, travel, and leadership together explain why life in the Mongol Empire required resilience far beyond what most outsiders could manage. Now we gather everything together: the land, the horses, the law, the families, the endless movement. And we look at the full weight of daily existence inside the Mongol Empire. Not the dramatic moments of battle, not the famous names carved into history, but the quiet, constant demands placed on every ordinary person who lived beneath that enormous sky. If you woke before dawn on the steppe, there would be no gentle beginning to your day. The air might already be sharp with cold or heavy with summer heat. Animals would need attention immediately. Horses must be checked for injury. Sheep must be counted. A single missing animal could mean hours of searching across open grassland. There are no fences to contain mistakes. Responsibility begins the moment your eyes open. Food preparation is not a matter of choice, but timing. Milk must be collected while animals are ready. Meat must be preserved quickly to avoid spoilage. Dried dung must be gathered and stored before rain ruins it. Every task links to another. There is no idle pause between them. A delay in one area creates a problem in another. And then there is movement. Even if there is no war, you move. Camps shift to protect grazing land. Herds travel to fresher pasture. Trade caravans pass through, bringing news and expectation. The world is never still. You must pack quickly, assemble the gyr frame, load carts, secure ropes, mount animals, and begin riding. Children participate. Elders guide decisions. The rhythm never truly stops. You might think the greatest challenge would be battle, but for most people, battle is rare compared to endurance. The true test is surviving winter storms without losing animals. It is riding for hours without clear landmarks. It is memorizing migration routes and water sources so accurately that you can guide others without hesitation. It is obeying leaders even when exhausted, because discipline protects everyone. Inside cities conquered by the Mongols, life is not softer. Taxes must be counted precisely. Officials record livestock numbers, grain stores, and trade goods. Merchants must present proper permits. Guards monitor gates. Relay riders arrive and depart constantly. The pressure of speed and of information and authority never fades. A delay in delivering a message can affect entire provinces. Law hovers quietly over everything. Theft, betrayal, or carelessness can bring swift consequence. Not because cruelty is the goal, but because instability spreads quickly in vast territories. Every person understands this. Order protects trade. Order protects herds. Order protects life itself. And above all stands the climate, indifferent and unyielding. The Mongols do not fight it. They anticipate it. They prepare months ahead for what cannot be controlled. That habit alone separates survival from collapse. An outsider accustomed to stable seasons and permanent walls would struggle with such constant uncertainty. Even social life requires resilience. Hospitality must be offered generously. Guests must behave correctly. Clan loyalty shapes decisions. Marriage alliances connect families across distances. Leadership requires visible strength. Reputation spreads faster than rumor in a land where riders carry news day and night. If you imagine yourself there now, placed without training into this world, you would feel exposed. There are no tall buildings to hide inside, no paved streets to guide direction, no guarantee of comfort tomorrow. You would need to ride confidently, endure hunger without complaint, follow strict custom, and think always of the group rather than yourself. And yet within this demanding life there is also strength. The Mongol Empire grew from these habits. Endurance made their armies fast. Discipline made their communication reliable. Mobility made their leadership flexible. Survival on the steppe created an empire that stretched farther across land than any before it. As the sun lowers slowly over the endless grassland, herds gather and dust settles in the cooling air. Fires glow softly inside circular tents. Somewhere in the distance, a lone rider moves along the horizon, carrying news that will reach another province by tomorrow. The land remains wide and silent, but beneath that silence lies constant motion and quiet readiness. This is why you would not last a day here, not because you lack courage, but because this world demands habits formed from childhood, resilience built over generations, and respect for land that does not forgive mistakes. The Mongol Empire was not only a force of conquest, it was a way of living shaped by wind, grass, loyalty, and endurance. As night deepens over the steppe and the last horses settle near the camp, there is one more part of Mongol life that explains their strength: childhood and training. Survival in this empire did not begin in adulthood. It began almost from birth. A Mongol did not suddenly learn endurance as a grown soldier. He grew into it slowly, year by year, until the skills of survival felt as natural as breathing. A small child in a Mongol family was rarely separated from daily work. Infants were wrapped warmly and carried as families moved between pastures. By the time a child could stand steadily, he was placed on a calm horse, held by an adult at first, then allowed to balance alone. There was no ceremony for learning to ride because riding was expected. Falling happened often, but it was part of learning. Soon, balance improved, and the horse became familiar rather than frightening. Bows came early as well. Children practiced with small versions aiming at simple targets placed near camp. At first, arrows barely traveled far, but repetition mattered more than distance. Over years, the muscles strengthened. The motion of drawing and releasing became effortless. Eventually, a rider could guide a horse with his legs while his hands focused entirely on the bow. For someone raised in a city, this coordination would take years to develop, yet Mongol youth learned it gradually through daily habit. Hunting also served as training. Groups rode out together, surrounding animals across open land. The goal was not only food, but practice in coordination. Riders communicated silently through signals and position, learning to move as a unit. Later, these same methods applied in warfare. What appeared to outsiders as sudden military skill was actually the continuation of familiar activity. Girls trained as well, though often in different responsibilities. They learned to manage herds, prepare food, and organize camp movement. Many rode confidently and could defend themselves if necessary. When men left on campaigns, women kept households functioning, proving that endurance was shared across the entire community. Memory formed another essential skill. Children learned routes to water sources, seasonal grazing grounds, and safe winter shelters. These were not written down. They were repeated through stories and guidance. A mistaken direction across the steppe could mean being lost far from help. Knowing the land was as important as knowing family. Discipline began early, too. Young people were taught respect for elders, obedience to leaders, and care for animals. Carelessness was corrected quickly because its consequences were real. Leaving a gate untied or misplacing equipment might endanger herds or people. Responsibility was not an abstract lesson. It was daily necessity. Games even served preparation. Wrestling strengthened bodies. Riding competitions improved control and speed. Archery contests encouraged accuracy. These activities created pride and skill at the same time. Entertainment and training blended together until there was little difference between them. By adulthood, a Mongol had years of practice behind him. He knew how to travel long distances, repair gear, care for animals, and respond quickly to commands. The environment had shaped him gradually. For an outsider arriving suddenly, the difference would be clear. What seemed exhausting and difficult to you would feel ordinary to him. As evening settles and families share a simple meal beside the fire, younger children listen to stories of past journeys and battles. These stories are not only entertainment. They pass knowledge forward, routes taken, mistakes avoided, and lessons remembered. Each generation prepares the next without formal schools, using experience and memory instead. In the next part, we will move toward the closing stretch and see how these lifelong habits allowed the Mongols to influence regions far beyond the steppe, connecting distant cultures and leaving marks on history that remained long after their riders stopped traveling those routes. Now we slowly move outward from the camps and herds to the wider world the Mongols changed, because the true impact of their lifestyle was not limited to the grasslands. Their habits, movement, discipline, and communication began to reshape entire continents. What began as survival in a harsh environment eventually connected lands that had long lived separately from one another. When the Mongol Empire expanded, its riders crossed mountains, deserts, forests, and river valleys. They did not remain only in familiar steppe regions. They entered cities filled with walls, markets, libraries, and crowded streets. Yet instead of completely replacing existing systems, they often linked them together. Routes that had once been dangerous or uncertain became guarded and organized. Merchants started traveling greater distances because they trusted they would reach the next station safely. Trade increased steadily. Silk from China reached the Middle East more reliably. Metalwork and glassware traveled eastward. Spices moved across Central Asia. Horses from the steppe were exchanged for textiles and tools. This movement of goods also carried knowledge. Techniques of papermaking spread. Methods of medicine, astronomy, and engineering passed from one region to another through merchants and scholars traveling under Mongol protection. Courts of Mongol rulers sometimes hosted visitors from very distant lands. Translators worked constantly because many languages were spoken. Advisors from different cultures shared ideas about administration, taxation, and building. The Mongols themselves often relied on these experts for managing cities while still maintaining their nomadic traditions. Their strength was not forcing uniform culture but allowing practical cooperation under one authority. Postal routes supported this exchange. Messages about trade opportunities, local conflicts, or environmental conditions reached leaders quickly. A shortage in one region could be reported and addressed from another. This flow of information helped maintain stability across territories that stretched farther than most people of the time could imagine. For ordinary people, this meant encountering unfamiliar customs. A merchant might meet traders from lands he had never heard of before. A craftsman could be relocated to serve a ruler far away. Religious travelers crossed continents to visit sacred places. The empire became a pathway rather than a barrier. Yet this connection also required constant order. Patrols guarded routes. Officials monitored trade, permits were checked at stations. The same strict law that governed steppe life extended across cities and deserts alike. Stability depended on predictable enforcement, and leaders understood that chaos in one region could spread quickly along travel routes. For you, living in this world would mean adapting repeatedly. One day you might ride through open grassland. Another day you might enter a crowded marketplace with unfamiliar language and food. You would need to follow Mongol authority while understanding local customs enough to avoid conflict. Survival depended on flexibility as much as endurance. As evening falls along a caravan road, travelers from different cultures share a fire, exchanging stories and gestures and simple words understood by all. Above them stretches the same wide sky that covers the steppe. The empire links distant places through movement, not walls. In the next part, we begin our final reflection, bringing together environment, family, law, and connection to understand why life in the Mongol Empire demanded a kind of resilience rarely required in more settled societies. We now come quietly toward the final understanding, and to see it clearly we must picture not a battle, not a leader, and not a caravan, but an ordinary evening in a Mongol camp. The sun has dropped low beyond the grasslands. Horses stand in small groups, occasionally shifting their weight. Smoke rises gently from the openings at the top of the gers. Inside, families sit close to the warmth of the central fire. There is no palace, no stone wall, no guard tower. And yet this simple scene supports an empire stretching across continents. What made survival here difficult was not a single danger. It was the constant combination of many demands. You were expected to understand weather, care for animals, obey law, respect elders, travel long distances, and remain ready for sudden movement. None of these tasks were optional. Each one depended on the others. A person who rode well but ignored custom could cause conflict. A person who followed law but could not endure the climate would fail physically. Survival required balance. The Mongols did not separate life into comfortable and difficult parts. Work, travel, family, and defense were all the same flow of activity. A morning might begin with milking animals, continue with repairing equipment, and end with preparing for migration to a new pasture. Rest existed, but it was never careless. Even relaxation included awareness of surroundings. Someone always watched the horizon. This awareness shaped character. Patience became necessary because weather could delay plans. Discipline became natural because disobedience endangered others. Cooperation mattered because no individual could manage herds, travel, and protection alone. Over generations, these habits formed a society capable of remarkable coordination. When armies moved quickly across thousands of kilometers, they were not acting suddenly. They were continuing the same organized behavior practiced daily at home. The open land also affected thinking. With no permanent boundaries, people measured distance by time and endurance rather than walls or streets. Direction came from memory and observation. A rider recognized hills, river bends, and stars. Losing awareness meant becoming lost. You would feel exposed without clear landmarks, while a Mongol felt oriented by subtle signs you might not notice. Even comfort had a different meaning. Warmth came from the fire and shared space. Food was valued because it required effort. Possessions remained few because mobility mattered more than accumulation. A person carried what could be packed quickly. Wealth existed, but it was often counted in animals rather than objects. When the empire reached cities far away, these habits did not disappear. Leaders might govern from urban centers, but they often returned to the steppe regularly. The open grassland remained the source of their identity. It reminded them how they learned endurance, loyalty, and cooperation. If you imagine living there, you begin to understand the difficulty. You would not fail from one dramatic moment. You would fail slowly, from fatigue, unfamiliar customs, cold nights, long rides, and constant responsibility. The Mongol world required lifelong preparation, not short-term courage. As darkness settles and stars appear across the clear sky, the camp grows quiet except for the low sounds of animals and wind. Somewhere far away, a messenger rides between stations, continuing the movement that holds the empire together. Life here does not pause, even in silence. In the next and final part, we will gently close this journey and reflect on what this way of life reveals. Why the Mongol Empire was not only powerful in war, but enduring in memory because it grew from survival itself. We continue our quiet walk across the steppe, and now we look at something people rarely imagine: rest. You might think that after long riding and constant work, night in a Mongol camp would be complete peace, but even rest here was different from the rest you know. Sleep existed, but it was never careless or deeply separated from responsibility. The camp never truly slept all at once. Guards were always awake. Horses had to be watched because they could wander, panic, or be taken by predators or enemies. A single lost horse meant loss of transport, and transport meant survival. So while families lay beneath thick blankets and felt coverings, someone remained alert near the outer edge of the camp, listening to the wind and watching the horizon even in darkness. Inside the GR, sleeping arrangements were simple and practical. Bedding was placed along the circular walls, leaving the center open for the hearth. Heat from the small fire slowly spread through the enclosed space. The felt walls blocked wind surprisingly well, but you could still hear the outside world. Hooves shifting, animals breathing, and sometimes the long sound of wind moving across open grassland. There were no doors that sealed completely. The environment was always present. Night itself required preparation. Before lying down, equipment was placed carefully so it could be reached quickly. Saddles were set ready. Boots were kept nearby. Clothing was not fully removed because sudden movement might be necessary. If weather changed or a messenger arrived, departure could happen within minutes. You would never experience the deep separation between day and night that exists in settled cities. Readiness remained even in sleep. The stars above the steppe played another role. Without city lights, the sky appeared extremely clear. Mongols learned directions by watching constellations. Night riders often navigated using them when traveling between camps. Even children recognized patterns overhead. For an outsider, the sky might look beautiful but confusing. For them, it was a map. Winter nights were especially demanding. Fires had to be maintained carefully so they did not go out completely. Fuel was limited, so it was fed slowly through the night. Someone might wake periodically to adjust it. If the fire died and cold filled the gyre, the temperature could drop dangerously before morning. Rest therefore included responsibility shared quietly among family members. Morning did not begin gradually. At first light, activity returned immediately. Animals were restless after long hours tethered. Water had to be collected, sometimes by breaking ice. Food preparation started quickly because travel might begin early. The idea of remaining in bed after sunrise would not fit this rhythm. The day began with necessity rather than comfort. You would also notice how quickly a peaceful camp could transform into movement. If scouts reported changing weather or better pasture elsewhere, the entire settlement prepared to relocate. Felt coverings were rolled, wooden frames folded, carts loaded, and herds gathered. Within a short time, the place where people had slept appeared empty again, leaving only flattened grass behind. Home was not the ground beneath the tent. Home was the community moving together. This constant readiness affected thinking. People planned lightly because plans changed easily. Flexibility mattered more than strict schedules. An outsider expecting predictability would feel unsettled, while Mongols saw adaptation as normal. And so the cycle repeated. Travel, settle briefly, rest lightly, and move again. Life here flowed like migration itself, never fixed, always prepared for the next change in weather or pasture. We continue onward, deeper into understanding how this rhythm shaped their endurance and why even a peaceful day demanded awareness and effort from every person within the empire. As our slow journey continues, we now notice something quieter than horses or weather: time itself. In the Mongol world, people did not measure the day by clocks or bells. They measured it by light, animals, and movement. Dawn meant work. Midday meant travel or grazing. Evening meant preparation for night. The passing of hours was felt rather than counted. Seasons mattered far more than days. Spring signaled births among herds and careful protection of young animals. Summer meant abundance of milk and long rides to prevent pastures from being overused. Autumn brought urgent preparation, storing food and strengthening shelters before cold returned. Winter demanded endurance and conservation. Each season carried different tasks, and forgetting the rhythm could lead to serious hardship. Without fixed calendars marking daily schedules, memory became essential. Families remembered when a valley usually held good grass or when a river flooded. Elders advised younger members when to move and when to stay. Knowledge of timing replaced written instructions. You would not simply look at a date to decide action. You would observe sky color, wind direction, and animal behavior. Even distance was measured differently. Instead of miles, riders spoke in days of travel. A place might be described as 3 days east or 2 nights south. The estimate depended on terrain, weather, and herd movement. Planning, therefore, required experience. A wrong judgment could leave a group far from water or shelter before nightfall. Trade caravans followed similar thinking. They departed at seasons when routes were safest, avoiding heavy snow or extreme heat. River crossings were timed when water levels allowed passage. Travelers adjusted their pace according to animals rather than personal preference. Patience mattered more than speed. This way of living affected how people viewed possessions. Objects had to be carried easily. Large furniture or heavy tools would slow migration, so belongings were chosen carefully. Containers were shaped for transport. Clothing was durable and repairable. Even decoration was often practical. Patterns stitched into garments while strengthening fabric. You would also notice that waiting was a normal part of life. Waiting for weather to change, waiting for herds to rest, waiting for riders to return with news. These pauses were not wasted time. but necessary patience. Stories were told, equipment repaired, and plans discussed while waiting. The community filled quiet hours together rather than alone. Because of this rhythm, sudden orders did not cause panic. When a leader called for movement, people were accustomed to responding quickly. Camps packed efficiently because they practiced often. Preparation had become habit. For someone raised in a fixed settlement, the absence of predictable routine would feel disorienting. You might search for familiar signals, a market opening, a bell ringing, a fixed hour of rest. But here the land itself set the schedule. The sky replaced the clock. As the sun lowers again across the wide grassland, long shadows stretch beside grazing animals. A rider returns slowly toward camp, guided not by marked road, but by memory of land. The day closes without announcement, and tomorrow will begin the same way, not by measured hour, but by light touching the horizon. We continue onward, still within this world of motion and patience, seeing how such a rhythm strengthened endurance across generations. Now we turn to something people rarely think about when imagining the Mongols: silence. The steppe was not filled with the constant noise of streets, markets, or crowded buildings. Most days were quiet. Wind moving through grass, hooves pressing against soil, animals grazing, and distant voices carried far across open space. This quietness changed how people behaved and how they paid attention to the world around them. Because the land was so open, sound traveled easily. A rider approaching could be heard long before he appeared. The barking of dogs, the movement of a herd, or the call of a guard carried across distance. Mongols learned to recognize these sounds instinctively. Silence itself was meaningful. When animals suddenly stopped moving or birds rose together, it could signal an approaching storm or stranger. Awareness came from listening as much as looking. For you, the lack of constant noise might feel peaceful at first, but it would quickly become unsettling. In cities, sound reassures people that others are nearby. On the steppe, quiet reminds you how exposed you are. There are no walls to block wind and no crowds to hide within. You must rely on your own attention and the group around you. This awareness extended to movement. Riders spaced themselves carefully when traveling, so dust clouds did not hide vision and so signals could be seen clearly. At night, fires were controlled to avoid drawing attention from afar. Even simple actions like approaching a juror followed custom. You slowed your horse, called out politely, and waited to be welcomed. Unexpected approach could cause alarm. Weather could also be heard before seen. Distant thunder rolled across plains long before clouds arrived. Wind changed tone as storms approached. Experienced families recognized these patterns and prepared quickly, securing equipment and animals. An outsider unfamiliar with these sounds might react too late. The quiet environment also encouraged memory and storytelling. Evenings around the fire were filled with spoken history, journeys, ancestors, roots, and lessons learned. Without written records in daily use, memory preserved knowledge. People listened carefully because stories carried practical instruction as well as entertainment. Through them, younger members learned how to travel, negotiate, and survive. Animals formed another part of this listening world. Horses reacted to scents and distant movement. A restless herd might warn of predators or strangers. Families watched animal behavior closely and trusted it. Survival meant noticing small changes quickly. Night on the steppe revealed another layer. Without artificial lights, the sky appeared bright with stars. Shapes of constellations became familiar guides. Riders traveling after sunset navigated by them, maintaining direction across land that looked identical by day. You would see only darkness and uncertainty, but they saw a map above them. Even communication within the camp respected quiet order. Loud arguments were discouraged because harmony preserved cooperation. Disputes were handled through elders or leaders rather than uncontrolled shouting. Calm behavior maintained unity within close living spaces. In this world, awareness replaced protection. Instead of relying on fortifications, people relied on attention to surroundings, shared knowledge, and immediate response. The land itself taught patience and observation. As evening settles again and wind softens across the grass, the camp rests in gentle silence. A guard walks slowly at the edge of the tents, listening more than watching. Somewhere far away, a lone rider moves across moonlit ground guided by stars alone. Life here depends not only on strength but on careful notice of every sound and change around you. And so we continue further, still within this open landscape, understanding how such constant awareness shaped a people capable of surviving where most others could not. Now we come gently to the final stretch of our long ride across the steppe. We have seen the climate, the families, the law, the leadership, the trade routes, the children growing into riders, the silence of the plains, and the endless movement that shaped every moment of life. And when all of these pieces are placed together, the picture becomes clear. You would not fail in the Mongol Empire because of one dramatic event. You would fail because life there demanded constant readiness. From the moment you woke, responsibility pressed against you. Animals needed care. Weather demanded preparation. Law required obedience. Travel required endurance. Custom required awareness. There was no separation between survival and daily routine. They were the same thing. The Mongol Empire did not grow powerful by accident. It grew from habits formed by generations living in one of the most demanding landscapes on Earth. When armies moved quickly across continents, they were simply applying skills learned from childhood, riding long distances, living lightly, obeying signals, trusting their unit. When leaders governed cities, they carried with them a mindset shaped by mobility and discipline. When trade routes flourished, they did so under strict order enforced by people who understood that stability meant survival. For an outsider, the openness of the land would feel overwhelming. The absence of walls would feel unsafe. The constant wind, the shifting seasons, the long distances without landmarks, all would wear you down slowly. You might admire the resilience of the people, but admiration is not the same as adaptation. The Mongol way of life required early training, shared memory, and lifelong endurance. And yet within this demanding world there was also clarity. Everyone knew their role. Families worked together. Leaders traveled among their people. Trade connected distant lands. The sky above was vast, but so was the sense of direction built into daily life. Movement replaced fear. Preparation replaced panic. Discipline replaced confusion. As the final evening settles across the grasslands, imagine one last quiet scene. Horses graze in fading light. A fire burns softly inside a circular tent. Children listen to stories of journeys across mountains and deserts. Somewhere far away, a rider carries news that will reach another province before the next sunrise. The wind moves across the steppe as it has for centuries, touching the same land that shaped an empire. The Mongol Empire was not only a force of conquest, It was a way of surviving where survival itself was never guaranteed. And that is why you would not last a day, not because you lack courage, but because this world demanded habits and resilience carved deeply into those who called it home. If you enjoyed this deep, slow journey into the life of the Mongol Empire, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and tell me which world we should step into next. There is always another horizon waiting beyond the grass. Good night, and until our next ride through history.